This video is essentially a breakdown of a particular dilemma that society seems to be facing these days, and as well a solution to this dilemma if a great majority of the people were to implement this solution. And it's somewhat of a spin-off of the work of Dr. Iain McGilchrist. And if you haven't heard of him, he's a psychiatrist, neuroscientist, philosopher, and many other things. He's done a great deal of work on the left and right hemispheres, how they function, and his suggestion is that society is largely conditioned to be left hemisphere dominant, while in reality, it's the right hemisphere that is more in tune with reality. And we would fare a great deal if we could uncondition ourselves from this left hemisphere dependency and be more right hemisphere dominant while simply using the left hemisphere as the tool rather than the master. And this is something that I'm guilty of as well. I'm naturally left hemisphere dominant. Just look at how this brow is stuck in a furrowed position now. From many years of just sitting in deep contemplation, over-intellectualizing reality, my face is more or less stuck like this in its resting position now. And that itself is a depiction of the left hemisphere. This is what the energy of the left hemisphere is like. It tends to be more pent up, angsty, strifeful, with a very narrow focus and one-pointedness. And that can be a useful tool, but the suggestion here is that if that left hemisphere approach becomes the dominant way of perception, then many things about reality will be completely overlooked. The left hemisphere tends to want to put everything into these little boxes of knowing. And the truth is, reality as a whole just doesn't fit into boxes. Boxes are the left hemisphere's best attempt to approximate reality so that it can understand it. It can put it into little bits and pieces that it can conceptualize. And again, that's just not how reality ultimately is. It doesn't really fit into these concepts that we impose on reality. Now, if you want a more detailed breakdown of the left and right hemispheres of the brain, I would suggest listening to Iain McGilchrist himself, whether it's reading his books and or listening to interviews with him. This video isn't his exact words, of course. This is my interpretation of what I've learned by reading his works and listening to him speak. So this video is, in a sense, an implementation of what I see that he's suggesting about how we're conditioned and how we could be more fulfilled as a society. This is me trying to illustrate it in a certain way so that we can better picture what it might look like to implement this wisdom. So the reason why the brain is split into two hemispheres in the first place, from a survival standpoint, is because an organism needs to be able to focus on its prey while remaining aware of its environment so that it doesn't become prey itself. So what the left hemisphere does is it has a much more narrow focus on its object of attention. And while the left hemisphere is focusing on a particular thing, the right hemisphere remains aware of the wholeness of the experience. So the right hemisphere includes the awareness that the left hemisphere has, but the left hemisphere does not include the awareness that the right hemisphere has. So it's essentially a much more narrow focus within a larger scope of attention. And the dilemma is that when we as a society become more left hemisphere dominant, what we tend to do is we overlook much about reality. We become deluded into thinking that our interpretation of reality, our strings of concepts, are reality itself, when in reality, it's not. And this is a habit of the left hemisphere because the whole purpose of the left hemisphere is grasping. It's grasping onto a particular object with an unwavering focus. That's how organisms are able to fixate their attention on prey and actually get it. This is how they're able to survive. So it's a good thing in that regard, but again, when it becomes the predominant way of thinking, then much about reality is overlooked. And the truth is, we as humans are not constantly in survival mode, so we can spare to relax our gaze of the left hemisphere and be more open to the mystery of reality. And to go into more detail about why exactly this is a dilemma for society is because we have many instances of people completely overlooking reality as it is and essentially living in their own delusion about reality. People tend to not be open to different points of view these days. You see it less and less, that people will argue their perspective and not be willing to see it another way. This unwavering rigidity of thought is directly the result of the left hemisphere grasping onto a particular story about reality and not letting go of it. And this can be likened to the ego or the sense of separate self. It's essentially a narrow focus of attention, which seems to divide everything, to put everything into boxes and distance itself from other objects of experience. And awakening in this sense would be like becoming more right hemisphere dominant, in which you're open to the undivided wholeness of everything, and you can perceive how things could be divided as a useful fiction, but you don't take that useful fiction to be reality itself. So it's the right hemisphere that can see. The left hemisphere needs to put things into boxes to conceptualize that this is a cow, for example, as opposed to a tree. It can see that that's a useful tool while not mistaking that useful tool to be a reality, that there's real division, that there's a real divisionary line between this and that. And this dichotomy of this versus that is a direct result of the left hemisphere dominance. And I think as a society, we have many instances to point to of how this has become a problem, of this black and white thinking, which tends to ignore the nuance of situations. And trailing it back to the ego, this is exactly why the ego suffers, because it's constantly grasping for an identity. The identity of the ego is in constant change, yet it's grasping with the expectation that it can grasp onto an identity that will last. So whenever that identity inevitably goes away or changes, then suffering arises. So this insatiable grasping of the left hemisphere, this grasping for a permanent identity with transient concepts, it inevitably results in suffering. So what it would look like to become more right hemisphere dominant essentially would be to relax a bit, to loosen up, and to be open to not knowing reality with precision, or at least not being able to translate reality into words, concepts, to not be discontent with not knowing oneself, to be open to the ineffability of what is. This might be what more right hemisphere dominance would appear as. And it's because there's no expectation for transient phenomena to become permanent that suffering does not arise from this right hemisphere dominance. It's only with this expectation of permanence with transience that suffering emerges. And what this shift of reliance from left to right might look like on a day-to-day basis is something as simple as just reminding yourself that whatever you're referring to within your experience, whenever you call a particular distinction a particular label, like this appearance a tree or this appearance a cow, just reminding yourself that that experience or that phenomena itself doesn't fit into that concept that you're associating with it. Just reminding yourself that the way that we try to interpret reality with concepts, it's not ultimately that, it's so much more. There's ineffability to it. This reminder to be open to the ineffability, the mystery of reality, is a way to loosen the grip of the left hemisphere. And it really has a way of expanding one's internal landscape, one's perception of reality. The horizon of your internal landscape becomes much more broad and vibrant. I notice that whenever we only focus to the particular concepts that we're associating with the experience, or I guess not only, but more so, when we attend to that more than the experience itself, it tends to dull the experience itself. So we overlook much about reality. The magic, the mystery of reality becomes overlooked through that. Our experience of reality really is a result of the attention that we're placing. So if we can shift our attention from the concepts to that which they're pointing to themselves, reality becomes much more vibrant and lustrous. It becomes much more visceral. The ego, or the sense of separateness, lives in a very small world, and that's essentially the whole game of the left hemisphere. It wants to place everything into these boxes of concepts so that it can know the reality that it's living in. And it's through knowing reality, or at least thinking that it knows reality, that it can feel safe and secure. However, when you know everything, you've taken away all the mystery, so reality becomes very small. If there's no mystery, there's no openness, there's no expansion, there's no areas of the unknown. And it's afraid to dive into that unknown because it doesn't see the security in it. It only wants to live in the world that it can know. So that's why ego death is a very scary thing. And while I can't promise that the unknown is safe, because the question arises, safe for who? It is much more true and pure. And the world that the ego, or the left hemisphere, lives within is essentially a delusion. If you're talking about knowing, you're ultimately talking about a delusion, because reality can't fully be known with any precision. We can only approximate things to relay information to one another, but those approximations are just that, approximations. They're generalizations, they're arbitrary delineations. Reality doesn't really fit into these boxes, which serve as useful tools for us. Reality is much, much more than that.